The cop's lie was perfect. The black man's evidence was gone. The case was lost. But they both forgot about one person in the courtroom, the judge, and the one question he was about to ask. Elijah Vance believed in the elegant certainty of numbers. As a former aerospace engineer who had helped design guidance systems for satellites, he understood that the universe operated on a set of immutable, logical laws. It was a worldview that had served him well, even after industry downsizing had led him to a second career as a high school physics teacher. He found a quiet satisfaction in explaining the predictable orbits of planets and the elegant simplicity of Newton's laws to his students. It was a world that made sense. The world outside his classroom, however, often failed to adhere to such logic. On a Tuesday afternoon, driving home in his meticulously maintained 10-year-old sedan, Elijah's orderly universe was violated by the sudden, jarring appearance of flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. He checked his speedometer, exactly the speed limit. His registration was current, his insurance paid. He signaled, pulled over to the shoulder, and waited, his mind already running through a diagnostic checklist, searching for the error in the system. Officer Miller approached the car with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man who enjoyed the power his uniform afforded him. He was in his late 40s, with a face that seemed permanently set in a discontented scowl. He tapped on the window with his flashlight, a gesture of unnecessary authority. Elijah lowered the window. "License and registration," Miller grunted, not making eye contact, instead letting his gaze sweep over the car's clean interior. "Of course, officer," Elijah said, his voice calm and even. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" He reached slowly and deliberately for the glove compartment to retrieve his documents, keeping his hands in plain sight. "You were weaving in your lane," Miller said, the accusation flat and rehearsed. It was a lie. Elijah, an engineer obsessed with precision, drove with the focused attention of a pilot. His car did not weave. It was a textbook pretext, the opening move in a game Elijah had been forced to play too many times. He handed over his documents. Miller took them, his eyes finally settling on Elijah. It was a long, appraising stare, filled with a dismissive prejudice that was as tangible as a physical touch. "Been drinking today, sir?" "No, officer. I'm coming from my job as a teacher at Northwood High." "A teacher, huh?" Miller smirked, as if the very idea were preposterous. He took the documents back to his cruiser. Elijah sat and waited, his hands on the steering wheel, his mind calm. He was not angry. Anger was an inefficient emotion. He was, however, collecting data. The time of the stop. The officer's name. The fabricated reason. The unwarranted insinuation. When Miller returned, his demeanor had shifted from casual contempt to active aggression. "I'm smelling marijuana in the vehicle, sir. I'm going to need you to step out." Another lie. A more dangerous one. "Officer, with all due respect, there is no marijuana in my car," Elijah stated, his voice still level but now edged with a new firmness. "I do not consent to a search." This was the challenge Miller had been waiting for. It was the friction he needed to justify an escalation. "Failure to consent gives me probable cause," he lied again, his voice rising. "Now get out of the car, or I'll pull you out." Knowing that resistance was futile and dangerous, Elijah complied. He stepped out of the car and stood on the gravel shoulder. "Officer, I am not a threat. I am a citizen being harassed. I would like to record this interaction for my own protection." He reached into his pocket for his smartphone. It was a calculated move, an appeal to the silent witness of technology. But for Miller, it was the final provocation. "He's got a weapon." Miller shouted, a performative yell for any unseen audience. In an instant, he slammed Elijah against the side of his own car, twisting his arm behind his back with a grunt. The phone clattered to the ground. Miller kicked it under the car. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," Miller snarled, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into Elijah's wrists. As he was forced into the back of the cruiser, Elijah looked back at his car, a symbol of his orderly life, now the scene of a chaotic injustice. He saw his phone lying in the dust under the front tire. His evidence. His voice. He knew, with the cold certainty of a failed calculation, that he would never see it again. He had followed the rules of a system he believed in. But the system, in the form of Officer Miller, had just proven that it operated on a different set of laws entirely. 6 hours later, Elijah was released. The charge of obstruction was dropped by a weary desk sergeant who knew a flimsy case when he saw one and didn't want the paperwork. There was no apology. His car keys and wallet were returned. His phone, however, was officially lost in evidence processing, a bureaucratic black hole from which nothing ever returned. He took a cab home, the silence of the ride a stark contrast to the buzzing injustice in his mind. The physical encounter had been brief, but the humiliation was a lingering stain. It was the casual, systemic nature of it all that angered him most, the predictable script of lies, the abuse of power, the erasure of his rights, all executed with the bored efficiency of a man swatting a fly. He walked into his small, tidy home to find his 16-year-old daughter, Maya, waiting for him, her face etched with worry. "Dad? I was so scared. Your phone was going straight to voicemail. I called the school." Seeing her fear was a blow more painful than any physical assault. He was her rock, her example of a world that, while not always fair, could be navigated with intelligence and integrity. What could he tell her now? That the very laws of physics he taught her, the predictable and logical rules of the universe, did not apply to a black man during a traffic stop. He sat down at the kitchen table, the exhaustion of the day settling into his bones. "I'm okay, sweetie," he said, his voice heavy. "There was an incident with the police." He told her everything, his voice a low, controlled monotone, an engineer reporting a critical system failure. He described the lies, the search, the arrest, the lost phone. Maya listened, her initial fear hardening into a reflection of his own quiet fury. "But, they can't just do that, can they?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They can't just lie and take your things and get away with it. That's not what you taught me." Her words struck him to the core. For years, he had taught her to believe in the system, to trust and reason, to use her voice to seek justice through the proper channels. He had raised her to be a citizen, not a cynic. What lesson would she learn if he simply accepted this violation? What would she think of the father who taught her to stand up for herself, if he did not stand up for his own dignity? "No," he said, his voice finding a new resolve. "No, they can't." That night, something shifted in Elijah Vance. The quiet, reserved science teacher made a decision. He would not let this go. He would not allow Officer Miller's casual bigotry to become just another unwritten, unproven anecdote of injustice. He would fight back, not with anger, but with the tools he knew best, logic, precision, and an unshakable faith in the power of empirical evidence, even if he had to rebuild his case from scratch. The next day, he contacted a civil rights attorney. He documented every detail of the encounter, creating a timeline with the precision of a mission plan. He noted the damage to his car's upholstery from Miller's aggressive search. He got a sworn affidavit from the cab driver who picked him up from the precinct. His case was thin. It was his word, the word of a black high school teacher, against the official report of a veteran police officer. He knew the odds. But he also knew that even the most complex systems have a single point of failure. He just had to find it. The lawsuit was filed a week later, Elijah Vance versus Officer Ray Miller, a quiet, methodical demand for accountability in a world that preferred silence. The courtroom was a world of hushed reverence and polished wood, a temple dedicated to the concept of objective truth. Yet, as Elijah Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, he felt as though he were in a foreign land where the language of logic he had mastered no longer applied. His lawyer, a sharp, passionate man named Ben Carter, had been clear about their chances. "Elijah, I believe you 100%, Ben had said in their final meeting. But you need to understand what we're up against. Without your phone's video, this case boils down to your word against his. In a courtroom, a police officer's uniform is a suit of armor. Their testimony is given immense weight. We are fighting an uphill battle. Elijah understood the equation. He understood that in this system, his identity as a peaceful, law-abiding citizen was a variable that could be easily erased by the constant of Officer Miller's badge. Still, he had to try. He had to demonstrate to his daughter that the fight itself mattered, regardless of the probable outcome. He took the stand first. Dressed in a simple, dark gray suit, he recounted the events of that afternoon with the calm, meticulous clarity of a scientist presenting his findings. He did not embellish. He did not appeal to emotion. He simply stated the facts as he had experienced them. He detailed the fabricated traffic violation, the lie about the smell of marijuana, the illegal search of his car, the confiscation of his phone, and the baseless arrest. He spoke of the humiliation, but he did it in the detached language of a man reporting on a flawed experiment. My rights, as I understood them, were systematically violated, he concluded, his gaze steady. My property was taken and not returned. I was arrested without cause and released without charge. I am here because the system designed to protect those rights failed. The cross-examination was brutal. The police department's lawyer, a slick, aggressive man named Peterson, worked to paint Elijah as an argumentative, uncooperative man with a chip on his shoulder. Mr. Vance, isn't it true that you refused to cooperate with Officer Miller from the beginning? I refused to consent to an illegal search, which is my constitutional right, Elijah corrected. So you were an expert on the law in that moment? Peterson sneered. I am an expert in my rights as a citizen. Isn't it true that you became belligerent and raised your voice at the officer? No, that is not true. My voice remained level throughout the entire encounter. So a veteran police officer is lying, but you, the man with a reason to be angry, are telling the complete truth. That is correct, Elijah said, his calm unwavering. He stepped down from the stand feeling a profound sense of futility. He had presented the truth, a logical sequence of events. But he had no proof. The system had a built-in bias, a default setting that favored the word of the uniform over the word of the citizen. He looked over at the jury, a panel of faces that were mostly white, mostly suburban. He saw polite skepticism, a hint of pity, but not belief. He saw them doing the math, weighing the probabilities. A decorated officer versus a black man with a grievance. In their eyes, the equation had already been solved. His case, he realized with a sinking heart, was already lost. When Officer Ray Miller took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He walked with a confident, self-assured stride, a man comfortable in his authority. He wore his dress uniform, the fabric crisp, the badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. He was the very picture of law and order, a stark contrast to the quiet, unassuming teacher he had arrested. He took the oath with a firm voice, looked the jury directly in the eye, and began to lie. His version of events was a masterwork of deception, a narrative built on a foundation of half-truths and outright fabrications, all delivered with the unshakable confidence of a man who had done this many times before. He began by establishing the context, painting a picture of a neighborhood on edge. Your Honor, members of the jury, he started, his tone grave and concerned. On the day in question, we had received multiple reports of a suspicious vehicle casing homes in that area. A string of daytime burglaries had the community on high alert. When I saw Mr. Vance's vehicle weaving erratically, it immediately raised a red flag. He described pulling Elijah over, portraying himself as calm, professional, and concerned for public safety. My intent was simply to check on the driver's welfare, he said smoothly. But his reaction was immediately hostile. He was argumentative, refused to answer basic questions, and seemed overly nervous. Now came the central lie, the justification for everything that followed. As I approached the vehicle, I detected the strong odor of marijuana, Miller stated, his expression serious. Based on my training and experience, I had probable cause to believe a crime was being committed. It was at that point that I asked Mr. Vance to step out of the vehicle for a pat-down and a search. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation sink in. He was a veteran officer. His training and experience were powerful words in a courtroom. Mr. Vance's hostility escalated, Miller continued, his voice rising with theatrical gravity. He became verbally abusive. He refused to exit the vehicle. When I opened the door, he made a sudden movement toward his pocket. Fearing for my safety, believing he might be reaching for a weapon, I had no choice but to use the minimum force necessary to restrain him and secure the scene. The lie was audacious. He had transformed Elijah's calm, rational act of reaching for a phone into a threatening gesture. He had turned his own aggression into a necessary act of self-defense. It was during the restraint that he began shouting and spitting, which is why the spit hood was later applied at the precinct, for the safety of all officers involved, he added, preemptively explaining away one of the most humiliating aspects of the arrest. His phone was taken into evidence as part of the ongoing investigation, as is standard procedure in such cases. The fact that he's now suing, after the DA was lenient enough to drop the charges, is frankly, an abuse of the system. He finished his testimony and looked at the jury, his expression one of weary resolve, the look of a good man forced to do a difficult job. It was a brilliant performance. He had taken every one of Elijah's truths and twisted them into a narrative that made him the hero and Elijah the villain. He had used the jury's inherent biases, their fear of crime, their trust in authority, their unfamiliarity with the subtle realities of racial profiling, to his advantage. During the cross-examination, he was immovable. Ben Carter, Elijah's lawyer, tried to find a crack in his story. "Officer Miller, you said his car was weaving. But your own report states there was no traffic citation issued. Why not?" "My primary concern was the potential for a DUI and the suspicious nature of the vehicle, not a minor traffic infraction," Miller replied smoothly. "And the marijuana you smelled, was any found in the vehicle?" "No. It's likely he had already consumed it." "And your body camera, officer? It would have recorded this entire interaction, correct?" Miller's face settled into a mask of professional regret. "Unfortunately, counselor, my camera experienced a technical malfunction that day. The battery died just as I was initiating the stop. A full report on the equipment failure was filed. It was a perfect, impenetrable wall of lies. He had an answer for everything. With no video from Elijah's lost phone and a malfunctioning body cam, the case was sealed. It was, as Ben had predicted, his word against Elijah's. And in this room, his word was worth more. Elijah watched as the jury members nodded along with Miller's testimony. He could see it in their eyes. They believed him. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, suffocating. Elijah's case was collapsing under the weight of Officer Miller's confident, well-rehearsed testimony. His lawyer, Ben Carter, had done his best, but without evidence, he was fighting with one hand tied behind his back. The police department's lawyer delivered a short, smug closing statement, portraying Miller as a hero and Elijah as a disgruntled opportunist. It was over. All that was left was the formality of the verdict. But the case wasn't over. Because they had all forgotten about the one person in the room who held the most power, the one person whose job it was to look past the performance and see the facts, Judge Peterson. Judge Peterson was a man in his late 60s, a jurist from an older school of thought. He believed in order, precedent, and, above all, the integrity of the process. He had listened to Officer Miller's testimony with his usual impassive expression, but behind his spectacles, his sharp, analytical mind was at work. Something bothered him. It wasn't a single, glaring lie. It was a collection of small, almost imperceptible inconsistencies, a sloppiness in the narrative that offended his sense of order. As the jury prepared to receive their instructions, Judge Peterson held up a hand. "One moment, counselors." A quiet murmur went through the room. This was unusual. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the police report on his desk. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "I have just a few clarifying questions for the court regarding your report." Miller, who had been relaxing in his chair, sat up straight. "Of course, Your Honor. Your report states you initiated the traffic stop at 3:14 p.m. at the intersection of Oak Street and Elm Avenue. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. And you state the reason was erratic weaving. Yet you were on patrol 2 miles away on the interstate just moments before, according to your own activity log. That's quite a distance to cover and observe a minor traffic violation." Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I was responding to the bolo on the burglaries, Your Honor. I was heading into that neighborhood." "I see," the judge said, his fingers steepled. "And after you arrested Mr. Vance at, let's say 3:25 p.m., what was your next action?" "I secured the suspect and awaited backup, then transported him to the precinct, Your Honor." "Did you make any radio calls immediately following the arrest?" Judge Peterson asked, his eyes fixed on the officer. A flicker of panic in Miller's eyes. Just a standard call to dispatch to report the arrest, Your Honor." "Are you certain?" the judge pressed. "Because the standard procedure is quite specific. A call reporting an arrest in progress, the suspect's name, the charges. All of it logged." "Yes, Your Honor. Standard procedure." Miller was sweating now. He had no idea where this was going, but he knew it was dangerous. Judge Peterson looked down at his desk, then back up. His voice was calm, almost academic. "Because it seems to me, officer, that a full, unredacted dispatch log from that afternoon, along with the GPS data from your patrol vehicle, would clear all of this up quite easily. It would show us exactly where you were, when you initiated the stop, and the content of your immediate post-arrest communications. I assume the department would have no issue providing the court with those standard electronic records." The police lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant and beyond the scope of this civil proceeding." Judge Peterson's gaze shifted to the lawyer, and it was like being hit with a blast of Arctic air. "Counselor," he said, his voice dangerously low, "are you suggesting that official police records, which could either corroborate or completely refute the sworn testimony of an officer in my courtroom, are irrelevant?" "Sit down." The lawyer sat down, his face pale. The judge turned back to a visibly trembling Miller. "So, officer, I ask again. Would the GPS and dispatch logs from your vehicle on that day confirm your testimony?" Miller's confidence had completely shattered. He stammered, "Your Honor, I can't be certain. Technology can be faulty." "I see." Judge Peterson gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to his clerk. "Then let's find out." He pressed a button on his console. "Mike," he said into the small microphone. "Please bring up the files I requested from the state police server this morning. Case number 734B, display them on the main screen." The courtroom held its breath. The large monitor behind the judge, previously dark, flickered to life. The first image was a map, showing the city grid. A small blue dot, labeled Patrol Unit 7, was visible. "This," the judge said, his voice a cold narration, "is the GPS data from your vehicle, Officer Miller. At 2:55 p.m., 15 minutes before the traffic stop, it shows your vehicle parked here, at the corner of Maple and Elm, 1 block from where you eventually pulled over Mr. Vance. You weren't on patrol. You were stationary. You were waiting." A collective gasp went through the gallery. "Now," the judge continued, "let's look at the dispatch logs." A transcript appeared on the screen. "I see your arrest call at 3:26 p.m. But I am more interested in the call you made on a secondary channel at 3:28 p.m., to Officer Peterson. Mike, please play the audio." The courtroom was utterly silent as a crackling, tinny voice filled the speakers. It was Miller's. Yeah, it's me. Listen, the stakeout was a bust. The guy in the Honda never showed. I had to make a move, so I pulled over a different car to look busy. Wrong guy, but he gave me some lip. I had to make it stick. You know how it is. The audio ended. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a career ending, of a man's life being irrevocably altered by his own words. Officer Miller had slumped in his chair, his face ashen, his lies exposed to the world by a technology he had forgotten existed. Elijah Vance closed his eyes for a moment, not in triumph, but in a wave of profound, weary vindication. The judge hadn't just found a piece of evidence. He had uncovered the entire, rotten truth. Judge Peterson surveyed the wreckage of Officer Miller's testimony, his face a mask of cold, judicial fury. He allowed the silence in his courtroom to stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment, forcing everyone to sit with the raw, ugly truth that had just been exposed. He then looked directly at the jury, whose faces reflected a mixture of shock and disgust. Members of the jury, the judge said, his voice resonating with absolute authority, in light of the electronic evidence presented, which directly and irrefutably contradicts the sworn testimony of Officer Miller, this court is directing a verdict in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Elijah Vance. A wave of applause started in the gallery but was instantly silenced by a sharp rap of the judge's gavel. Order, he commanded. This is not a sporting event. He turned his attention back to Officer Miller, who looked like a man in a waking nightmare. Officer Miller, you have not only violated the civil rights of Mr. Vance in a manner that is both malicious and racially motivated, but you have also committed multiple felonies in this very courtroom. You have lied under oath. You have presented a fabricated official report. You have shown a contempt for this court and for the very laws you swore to uphold that I have seldom witnessed in my 30 years on this bench. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before landing back on the disgraced officer. Your badge is not a shield for your prejudice or a license for your lies. It is a symbol of public trust. A trust you have shattered. He pointed his gavel at Miller. I am referring this entire case, including the transcripts of your testimony and the electronic evidence, to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution on charges of perjury, filing a false police report, and abuse of authority. And as for your conduct here today. He lifted the gavel high. I find you in contempt of court. Bailiff, take this man into custody. He will be remanded until his own trial date is set. As the bailiffs moved in to cuff a stunned and sputtering Miller, Judge Peterson turned to Elijah. His voice softened for the first time. Mr. Vance. On behalf of the justice system, I offer you my most sincere apology. We failed you. But I hope today, we have begun to correct that failure. Elijah simply nodded, a universe of emotion passing behind his calm eyes. Later, outside the courthouse, Elijah and his daughter Maya stood on the steps, blinking in the bright afternoon sun. They were surrounded by a swarm of reporters, but they ignored the shouted questions. Maya hugged her father tightly. You did it, Dad, she whispered, her voice thick with pride. You showed them. Elijah looked out over the city, his city. He hadn't won a war. He hadn't become a hero. He had simply taken a stand, armed with nothing but the truth and a belief in a system that, for one day, in one courtroom, had finally worked. And for his daughter, who looked at him with newfound awe, that was more than enough. Justice had been served. If this story reminds you that the truth is the most powerful weapon, and that one person's integrity can change everything, like this video, subscribe for more stories of justice, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that the fight is always worth it.